Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs, a rather dismal diagnostic pertaining to the ever growing encroachment of that most rapacious of institutions known as the state. So, Robert Higgs, if you don't know, is an American economist, and the aim of this book, Crisis and Leviathan, which was, I believe, written in the late 1980s, is rather simple, although it is quite in depth as regards the explication of its main thesis, that being to illustrate how government expands its size and scope, and specifically how it does so in relation to times of crisis. Now, this book focuses only on the history of America and American government. A book covering this process for more nations than that would be a much longer book. But like I say, this book only covers the history of the United States, and it more or less starts out with analyzing the mode of governance of the administration of Grover Cleveland. And this is important because Grover Cleveland, a rather unsung and often overlooked and even forgotten American president, is nonetheless very important in American history because Grover Cleveland was the final United States president who governed by the tenets of classical liberalism. And again, Higgs examines his mode of governance and his very more or less hands-off approach. And from there, he contrasts this with the progressive era which followed the tenure of Grover Cleveland, which in turn eventually found its apogee in the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And this is where things went catastrophically wrong, or at least in my opinion anyway. And another thing to make note of here is that the mode of governance for a nation changes as a result of the changes in ideology of the population of that nation. And this is something that some people might be apt to get mixed up, because it's kind of common that a lot of people think that politics is like at the top of the chain, so to speak, when it comes to the transformation of society. But this really is not the case. In fact, it was Friedrich Hayek, I think, who really pointed out and who made true documentation of the fact that politics is really only ever downstream from ideology. And ideology is crafted predominantly by philosophers, which it then kind of drifts down through institutions such as universities and academics and such, and then eventually filters out and diffuses out into society at large, and then the populace manifests this ideology in their elected officials. It's the changes in government are a result of the changes in ideology, but kind of, again, the central thesis of the book here is that ideology often changes as a result of times of crisis. So, like I say, the Grover Cleveland administration was the final administration by an American president to adhere to the, more or less anyway, to the tenets of classical liberalism and individual personal sovereignty and a largely hands-off policy. And then following that, you get the progressive era under figures such as like Teddy Roosevelt. But like I say, that era eventually found its apogee in the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And like I say, this is where things went horribly wrong. First of all, this is where we get finally the irrevocable income tax and the creation of the Federal Reserve, but also with the onset of World War I and America's involvement in that, we get massive, like unprecedented advances in government power and authority in the private sector and the economy. And it is essentially fascism. Like, again, the word fascism nowadays is so overused that it has very little meaning left. But if you want to get right down to it, the administration of Woodrow Wilson was, or at least during the time of America's involvement in World War I, was essentially a fascist administration, even though, you can say, well, we have the Constitution and checks and balances. Yeah, but the authority of the government became so pervasive and powerful that it's difficult to call that anything other than at least fascism light anyway. So you get a true garrison economy, and also you get the draft, right? I mean, America had a draft in the Civil War, but the draft here was a drastic increase in manpower, and again, a drastic increase in just how far the government can reach into the lives of citizens. But after World War One, things calmed down a little bit. But the thing to be noted here is that things did not go back to the way they were. And this is perhaps the most important thing, which Crisis in Leviathan points out, is that once something changes, it's as regards government and its relation to private civilians and their economic affairs, it's very difficult, if not nigh impossible, to change it back. And so while things calmed down, things did not go back to the way they were previously. You still had the income tax, you still had the Federal Reserve, but things generally, kind of calmed down. Much of the fascist, quote unquote, elements which had been created during the wartime era faded into the background, and kind of the hold was relaxed, but it did not go away completely. Then, of course, comes the next big crisis in American history, the Great Depression. And from there, we come to the eventual administration of Franklin Roosevelt. And this is truly this is like on another level when it comes to governmental power and authority. It marked a return, and not only a return, an increase, a ratcheting up. In fact, that's what the kind of central hypothesis of this book is. It's called like the ratchet hypothesis of how times of crisis cause a ratcheting up of governmental power. But anyway, so under the Roosevelt administration, the fascistic elements of the Wilson administration returned, and they returned stronger than they were. You get, again, a true garrison economy, especially as America went into World War II. Massive price controls, wage controls, massive governmental interference in the relationship between labor and capital, and massive alterations in taxation and governmental expenditures. Huge deficits, just absolutely just gargantuan deficits, massive deficit spending for the government. And then eventually, like I said, comes World War II, and then the lid was just blown off, because now we get a draft again. We see the full return, like I said, of the garrison economy, like true full, like quote unquote fascism, basically. And we also see how tenuous the ideals of America actually can be. And this is a point that I think is important to make here, is that, especially as regards the Roosevelt administration, as noble as the United States Constitution is as a document, it is nonetheless still just a work of ink and paper, and it relies always upon the interpretation and execution of flesh and blood human beings. And flesh and blood human beings have very different views oftentimes regarding things. And when it comes to the FDR administration, we see just how loosely things can be interpreted, even though there is very little precedent sometimes for these decisions which the powers that be will make. And what I'm referring to is that as regards like the Supreme Court, because a lot of the justices of the Supreme Court were, kind of quote unquote like activist justices who were really looking themselves to aid the government in its expansion. And so they let pass a lot of things which justices prior to them would never in a million years have even dreamed of letting slide, as like in comparison to like the Grover Cleveland administration, where none of this would ever have even been like imaginable. But even when the justices balked some of FDR's policies, you get, of course, the infamous court packing scheme, where he was going to just add seats to the court to railroad through whatever the hell he wanted to pass. And again, we see in instances like these the fragility of the ideals upon which America was founded, because they only ever exist really in the minds of people, and people have very different views. And so, even though the United States Constitution provides a pretty good framework, and it does provide a great means of checks and balances, it is not by any means fail proof. Like you can go around it, you can go through it at times, like FDR did in a lot of cases. It is not going to save you ultimately from the reach of Big Brother. But anyway, so after World War II, a lot of things changed. One, the draft did not go away, and that is a major, major turning point here. Is that after the Civil War, even after World War One, the draft went away. The size of America's military shrank dramatically, but after World War II, this was not the case, and the draft remained in place during peacetime, but also the massive boost in governmental expenditures remained, such as like Social Security, and those programs were actually expanded, even by presidents that followed who were quote unquote conservative presidents, such as like Eisenhower. There was no real attempt to abolish any of these measures which were put in place previously. And that is another very, very important thing to note, which Higgs points out in the book, is that once these things change, again, once the ideology changes, it changes the entire framework basically within which these various political actors operate. And so even politicians who identify as, again, quote unquote conservatives, very rarely make any actual attempt at scaling back the size of Leviathan. In particular, the final portions of the book are dedicated to the administrations of like JFK and Johnson and Nixon up to the Reagan administration, which is when this book was written. And again, you see the fact that the ideology has changed to the point where even the people who profess some degree of opposition to the just absolutely colossal size of the government and what it has become, they often don't really do anything to really combat it, or they actually boost it in their own right. And this is very plain in the administration of Richard Nixon, because if you did not already know, that Richard Nixon was a Republican, and you just looked at like the stuff that he did, like the things that he passed, like the EPA, as well as the price controls and stuff like that on fuel and such. If you just looked at like his record, you would say this dude is like the most progressive, like left wing type politician ever, because the ideology had been changed to the point where even those who identify as, again, quote unquote conservatives, their thinking is now trapped within the ideological framework, which has been forever altered. And the funny thing is that the book ends kind of with just a quick recap of like the Reagan Revolution, right? Which, as Higgs said, even though Reagan talked a big game about, like return to form, so to speak, for America as regards the role of government, he barely dented anything. It was just business as usual at that point, and so it has been up to the present. But the funny thing that Higgs points out is that since all the actors within the milieu of the political scene have been altered pretty much in their thinking by the crises of the past and the way that the government has ratcheted up its power, those few, and like very few, who actually do like genuinely oppose the government, like true, genuine, like bona fide, real conservatives, like I might say Ron Paul, are generally regarded as cranks, like insane people. Like if you recall, if you were around at that time, when Ron Paul ran for president in 2008. People thought he was just absolutely batshit crazy. But the ironic thing, the comically ironic thing, is that his views, his positions, are only pretty much those upon which the United States was actually founded. But we no longer even recognize that, or most of us don't, because our mindset has been changed so much by the growth of government. We're like an old person looking at pictures of ourselves in our youth and not recognizing our own figure from the past. It's an interesting thing that Higgs points out here, is that um, if you want to like really like play the game, so to speak, you kind of have to do it within the framework that you have. Again, like I say, Nixon, like Republican, but he was one of the most progressive of that party ever. And also, you can see it with like even with Trump today, like Donald Trump, a Republican, um, ostensibly of the conservative party, but like, good lord, his administration just took a 10% stake in Intel. I mean, damn, that's a Chinese move right there. Good God. But what I'm saying is that this book shows how all that came to be. How the government grows and grows. We lose our rights by the day, pretty much. And it's all because of, or largely because of, times of crisis, times of hardship and duress. And a thing to be noted here, I think, is that uh, there's a certain weakness in people, or at least in the bulk of people, which permits this. Uh, of course, there's always the people, the intelligentsia, so to speak, who craft the ideological changes necessary to see the election of officials who will expand the scope of the state. But in times of crisis, as this book makes very plain, people have a tendency to um, either actively look to the state to solve their problems, to do something, or to at least just shut up and go along to get along. There are generally comparatively few people of the masses anyway, in times of crisis, who will say, "Hell no! What are we doing? We're giving up our freaking rights here. Like, we're letting ourselves be led along by the nose. We're having our lives regimented by the powers that be. We're having the government has basically just assumed the power to dispose of human life as it sees fit, and also to regulate all economic affairs. Like, what are we doing? Like, there are comparatively few figures of the bulk of the masses that will stand up and do that, and that's kind of the depressing thing, I think, that this book illustrates, is that the state grows because we as people generally are so weak that we will allow fear to uh, override the nobler aspects of our character, and we will throw it all away for the promise of security and safety. And like I say, this book was written in the late 1980s, and it has a foreword because it's like the 25th anniversary of the book. And Robert Higgs says in the foreword, I could have went back and added a lot of stuff to this that only would have, uh, proved further my theory with this book, but I didn't have to, because it speaks for itself, and it really does speak for itself. Like, I mean, think about 9/11. Like, can you say Patriot Act out there? Again, a mass tragedy, a national crisis in which people were um, goaded largely by the powers that be to um, be instilled with a fear of terrorism and foreign reprisals and whatnot, which led them to not, a lot of them at least, to not really balk that much at the implementation of one of the most egregiously unconstitutional and immoral pieces of legislation in United States history. And of course, coming on from there, not just that, You come on to like COVID, right? Like that's probably the most recent instance is COVID, and like again, it was so alarming to see the amount of people which will throw their freedoms away is at the drop of a hat as soon as as soon as Big Brother tells them to. And you know I am not getting on a high horse here because I was one of those. I allowed myself to be instilled with sufficient fear to break down and actually consent to getting that godforsaken vaccine, which I was adamantly against getting. But again, I allowed myself to be scared into doing that, and it nearly killed me. I mean, it gave me a fever of 106, and it gave me that heart issue, myocarditis or whatever it's called. So yeah, that is the last time. That is the last freaking time I ever will listen to anything that the government says in times of crisis when it comes to what they want you to do. Hell no. Like that taught me I will not be one of the sheeple who goes along in times of crisis. I don't give a damn how bad it gets. I don't care if there are corpses piled up in the streets. I will not again be a party to the forfeiture of freedom because times get hard. That set me straight right there. But anyway, this is all just to say that this book is incredibly valuable because it illustrates with great, I mean, immense historical documentation a very dismal process by which the freedoms and rights of individuals are eroded and the state expands in scope and power, and especially how it does this in times of crisis and hardship, and how people are goaded and led by their fear into surrendering what is rightfully theirs. Very valuable book, very, very valuable book. Crisis and Leviathan. You know, I don't really rate non-fictional works like this generally, but I will say this book is powerful. It is in many ways infuriating. Like there were times reading this where I was like, I could physically feel myself getting angry because of the quotations that Robert Higgs quotes from these powerful figures and how they will just run roughshod over anyone and anything that gets in their way, and all in the name of the greater good. Do not buy into that shit. Don't ever give up your freedom. Do not sell your soul like Faust for security. Do not do it. It is not worth it. Anyway, so even though I won't give this book a rating, I think it is immensely valuable, a fantastic book, and one that is a vital necessity to read because there's a lot of people out there that need to read this book to understand how we lose what should be ours. But anyway, Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs. Have you read it? If you have, let me know in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And if you haven't read Crisis and Leviathan, read it. You need to read it. You need to understand this process by which we are gradually caged and how that cage gradually, or sometimes not so gradually, becomes smaller and smaller and our freedoms less and less. Read it. This is a very high recommendation for me. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.